Greetings. My name is Daniel Foor, and I'm delighted today to be interviewing a friend and colleague and ritualist and educator, Lindsay Sudeikis. Lindsay is a practitioner of Catholicism and Catholic mystical traditions. She's also steeped in earth-honoring wisdoms and has a tradition of scholar activism. And Lindsay's lived for 6 years as a Catholic nun in Italy with 54 nuns from 16 different cultures, learned Spanish and Italian during that time. She has a master's in liberal studies and is steeped in education and transformative justice, liberatory forms of education. Her ancestors of blood are from Lithuania, Poland, Ireland, England, and Germany by way of Chicago and Kansas. And she lives now in Brooklyn, New York, and is also a practitioner of ancestral lineage healing in the method that I've developed. And she is, in her own words, committed to unearthing the profound complementarity between ancestral healing and Catholic mystical teaching for the deeply needed healing in our times. And some of the specific Catholic ancestors and mystics who have inspired and continue to nourish her path are Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Padre Pio, and Thomas of Aquinas. And it's great to have you here, Lindsay. I'm delighted to invite you to dispel some of my misunderstandings about Catholicism and to just welcome you to a great conversation. And I wonder if you'd be willing for our listeners to open things up with a prayer.
Yeah. Yes, grateful to be together. Maybe let's just drop in and pray. In Latin, it's the Hail Mary, the Ave Maria, which is a ancient prayer of this tradition. So just asking the Blessed Mother's intercession for clarity and grace and ease and joy in our time together, and for any of the listeners. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. And that last line is pray for us now at the hour of our death. Amen.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
thank you so much. And just for context, I didn't mention it. If people want to know about my background or my practice, it's ancestormedicine.org, and I'm Daniel Foor. One of the things we have in common is an interest in religion and study of religion. So I did an undergraduate in religion, but I didn't study Christianity that much. So I'm embarrassingly uninformed in some ways. And one of the fruitful things about our connection has been you're challenging my assumption that Christianity in general, including Catholicism, has a kind of aversion to ancestor reverence and ritual. It's frowned upon. And so can you help me and our listeners who might come with that assumption to dispel some of that from a Catholic perspective, from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I will say that when dropping in to a 3-day intensive with you, which was like about over a year ago, you shared out around those like 5 core principles that you work with. And when you were listing them, I was like, oh, noted. They were all very resonant with the Catholic mystical tradition. And so, simply as how ancestors are alive in the present, how you would say that first one, that after death, consciousness or soul continues. Yeah. It was like, okay, check, right? And then that not all the dead are equally well.
No doubt. Something I actually really respect about Catholicism and Islam. Yeah. I studied Islam more. I'm like, people could stand to remember that one. But yeah.
Yes, people could stand, and it's like the Catholic mystical tradition, correct? Not all the dead are equally well. And then, the dead can change. And so, in church teaching, there's something called the church militant, the church suffering, and the church triumphant, which refers to the church on earth, church militant is like folks who are fighting the good fight, singing the new song. The church suffering would be those who have breathed their last, but are in a moment of purgation to be able to transition fully to become well-seated ancestors. And then the church triumphant are well-seated ancestors / the cloud of witnesses / yeah, those are two ways that or the communion of saints also is the jargon or the languaging that Catholics would use. So I was like, yeah, and the dead, and then the fourth one that you list, right? How the dead can impact the living, have impact on the living. That I love when you use that example of a tree, like the roots, the branch, impact the branches. It's like, yes, we concur. And that actually the impact, there can be communication between the two realms. So in the Catholic Church, the entire month of November, for example, is dedicated to praying for the dead in a very intentional and explicit way. And in every holy sacrifice of the Mass, the dead are prayed for in a specific way. Before meals, may the souls of the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. So I think that's where I would begin with the complementarity between the two and dispelling kind of some of the myths.
It's great.
Yeah.
I kind of checkmated on it. The imprint I have received may be more from a modern American, certain kind of evangelical Protestant, different angle of Christianity that has at times a literalism or a really reductionistic kind of vibe to it. So help me to know, in this communicating to the dead, through prayers or through gratitude or different, demographics among the dead, those who are, you said the suffering and the triumphant. So recognizing different states of wellness among the dead. Mm-hmm. Is it normal for Catholics to receive a communication back? How about that? Does a communication come back as well?
Well, I think what I would say is that certainly a communication comes back when you think about ancestors of path, right? Like what Catholics would call the saints. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of dialogue and deep communication to and an actual dialogue with Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross or Thomas Aquinas, that many Catholics have very profound devotions to those well-seated ancestors. And so one of the things that I'm curious about unearthing is saying, well, if we can be in dialogue, open dialogue and relationship with those well-seated ancestors, what about also being in dialogue with the blood and bones of our bones of our bones, who are also invited to be part of the cloud of witnesses and well-seated ancestors, which is the church teaching, full stop, that each of us is invited into living a life of divine intimacy and divine love here, and then we'll continue on through after we die. And so it is present in the church. And what I'm saying and trying to bring to is saying, well, let's have it be present even with our blood ancestors, that it can be real there.
Is it the view that if folks are not Catholic during life, that they would not have an experience of, if it works, let me move out of the way that heaven and hell can get used so many different ways, but to say among the triumphant among the dead or the well-seated ancestors, that is it I don't know if you'd say mainstream kind of view that one needs to achieve that wellness through being Catholic only? That's the only pathway by which to achieve it?
No, I mean, and actually even just the most recent ecumenical council in the Catholic Church was Vatican II, which I'm sure heard about, was from 1962 to 1965. And in that council, the word ecumenical meaning to bring together, and what can be both interreligious about the council and meeting all faith traditions where they're at. A big part of it was the fact that it's not only folks who identify as Catholic, who are admitted in, if you will, to the church triumphant, or who can become well-seated ancestors, but by virtue of anyone's desire, people of goodwill is the language in the Holy Mass also, and from the Council of Vatican II, that folks of goodwill and who have desire to be of service and to be of love divine, that is the access. That's the part that matters. Yeah.
Is it fair in my attempt to bridge out of different kinds of misunderstanding to equate heaven, if you will, with the church triumphant of a state, a post-mortem state of wellness, I guess.
Yes, I would say yes. I don't use the word heaven so much in my lexicon or in my orientation towards mysticism. So I would say, Teresa of Avila, who is truly a real heavy hitter and spoke a lot of truth to power in her time frame of the 16th century. So someone I really identify with, and she was Orthodox and within the church, but pushing the church out. She has this beautiful prayer in the Act of Charity that she says, your love so holds my heart that if there were no heaven, I would still love you. And if there were no hell, I would still revere you. And so it's really that love that compels those of us who are espoused to the Catholic mystical tradition, which is anchored in the Song of Songs, which is a part of the scriptures, the Christian, Jewish and Christian scriptures, that opens with the line, oh, that you may kiss me with the kisses of your mouth, draw me after you, my lover belongs to me, and my lover belongs to me, and I to my lover. It's very, so I would encourage maybe any of the listeners and yourself included that I think those concepts of heaven or hell have actually been an obstacle to what G.K. Chesterton says is the essence of Catholicism. It's, he says it's the greatest love affair ever to exist. Mm-hmm. And those who are listening and yourself, that's why the Sufi mystic tradition of Rumi, and there's a lot of resonance when you start to look at this beloved and lover. And so I would be hesitant to equate heaven equals church triumphant. I think I start there because when trying to give Catholic folks a framework for what you're sharing about the dead aren't all equally well and that the dead can change, it's like good, distinct, and we concur.
That's the part I want to unpackage too, is the flip of it. As soon as having studied Islam at some depth and Sufism, when views of hell, so to speak, or Jinnah, or the purifying fire, and a state of high levels of discomfort that folks who live badly may encounter, when it's construed as a process of purification that endures for as long as it's needed to achieve its result, that seems very sensible. Mm-hmm. And congruent with most any teaching I've encountered in other places, that you can't be a really harmful person and expect to just opt out of consequence because the body died, because the soul has a deeper continuity.
That's right.
So is that congruent with your mystical orientation within Catholicism, that insofar as heaven and hell are, operative concepts that are still in the mix, that they refer more to, conditions that one can move through, or that there's a kind of purification, if you will, something like that?
Yes, and I would say yes, and some of the way you're describing an Islamic understanding around, or your own understanding around purification, would be probably traditionally more seen as like what the church teaches as purgatory, which is a real purifying state between when the soul breathes their last until they become well-seated ancestors. When it comes to the reality of hell, again, Therese of Lisieux and Teresa of Avila, Bernard of Clairvaux, they want to remain Orthodox. So they say something along the lines of hell is a reality, but they don't think necessarily anyone's there, And so, and in the Pentateuch, which is the Torah, the first 5 books of scripture, there's no mention of the word hell. Paul, who's the most prolific writer in Christianity, never uses the word hell. It's actually not found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And so I think, again, Dante's Inferno really did a number, I think, in the Western psyche around heaven and hell, and popularizing them in a way that may not have behooved us ultimately. So, I would would say that. But I think the most important would be about freedom. The understanding around the human experience is that source, mystery, God has bestowed upon us, has given us freedom, and that in that freedom we can choose to lean in and love deeply and cry deeply, and or we can choose to be, you know, to walk away. And
Yeah.
so it's really, to anchor it, I think, in freedom is important, you know, because that's really what the heart of the matter.
And if we say it's similar in Islam that humans are characterized by choice,
That's right.
and if we say that choice certainly pertains while incarnate, and let's say it extends at least to some capacity after death as well, and we frame purgatory as ideally a consensual or opt-in state of purification, but perhaps if one's resisting it, could have a more hellish or uncomfortable, stuck quality to it.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, can you speak a little to the practices that one could engage in while alive that could assist those who have passed to, we can't do another's work for them, and yet we're all profoundly connected. And
Right.
are there practices to assist those in purgatory?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, you know, in Holy Mass, um, kind of the full name is called the Holy Sacrifice, the Mass, or also called the Wedding Feast of the Lamb. There's this moment between the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist that any of the listeners who are Catholic would know, called the Sanctus, 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 like holy, 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 and you're calling in, and like the entire church triumphant, church suffering, church militant, that in every Holy Mass, the mystery is that all become fully present in that moment. And in that time, it's like a very potent moment to presence those who have died and gone before us, to assist them in transitioning. And in every Mass, there's certain words, languaging in the Eucharistic prayer, which is when it's right after what's called the transubstantiation, where we believe that the bread and wine are transformed into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. After that moment, there's a moment where the priest prays in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, for those who have died specifically, and emphasis on the church suffering. And when the priest is praying that, you know, it's not just him praying it. We're invited in to be full, wholehearted participants in that, which is another big part of Vatican II, that it's not just like the priest is out there doing it on behalf of us, that we really are being invited in to full participation in that prayer. And so that's a very potent time to pray for them. Also, this prayer that's traditionally before meals and after meals, just that's very simply, may the souls of the departed through the mercy of God rest in peace, and calling those to mind and heart. Also, like praying candles, votive offerings in different, in all the Catholic churches you walk into, there's always something to, a shrine to the Blessed Mother, a shrine to Saint Joseph. Saint Joseph's the patron saint of a holy death. So a lot of folks, when they know that, like if I knew someone close to me was about to die, I would ask Saint Joseph to ready their hearts, to prepare them for the grace of a holy death. Praying the rosary is a potent, tender prayer, inviting in. So all of those ways, are ways to assist.
It's a question I hadn't intended to ask, but I've noticed in traditions that have a lot of intact ritual, that an awesome quality about it is that a person who may not be very psychic or intuitively tapped in can just do the rituals and typically get the benefit of having done them. Like that's the ancestral technology. It's effective. It's passed on because it works, hopefully. And yet a downside or a different function is that there's not always a felt sense of like knowing if it worked, or of direct contact with the ones that a person's directing a prayer for. So is it, I mean, I assume it happens, of course, but is it recognized and talked about as a thing that so-and-so did a bunch of prayers, and then, well, maybe a dream happened, and it was shown that it worked, or that so-and-so was in a better place? Or how about the call and response direct experience of it aspect?
Yes, it's a great question and a great thing to bring up, for sure, because I think something I have noticed when stumbling upon this work is that the technology you've come up with and been inspired to come up with, and the Catholic mystical tradition, I think when you put those together, there's a way that you start to really sense in and lean into like the echo back of like, oh, wow, there's really something happening here. So sometimes when you and I've talked before, maybe Catholic folk are a little like, whoa, treading lightly. Like, what do you mean I'm going to like talk to the dead and get my people well? Like easy,
Right. The practices are,
Precisely.
What are you doing? You're
Precisely.
Yeah.
Wait, say it again. But the practice what?
The practices are intending to contact them. So you're just you just opening up the little veil on what you're already doing. I think, no?
Exactly, which is why when stumbling upon this work, I thought people are like, what brought you to the work? I'm like, oh, life, period. Because it's so connected. So I think that the modality, yeah. Well, I just make sense is that it's a way I have, my heart was already so prepared in a way because of these different practices I've had. And I've, for the last 20 years of being a like full throttle, like hardcore Catholic, with levity and all the things, that when stumbling upon this, I'm like, oh, wow, there's this whole other way to communicate and to be in dialogue and to be in more active relationship to receive kind of that echo back, that, and so the church is teaching around, we're all called to be saints, which is a big part of the universal call to holiness, from Matthew 25:14, we're all called to be in this intimate union with God. And I'm like, well, our blood ancestors aren't excluded from that invitation. So when they die, how come we can be so okay with the Mother Teresa of Calcutta's becoming well-seated ancestors and not our great-great-grandparents or our great-great-great-grandparents?
Do you think, like, I don't have the exact timeline. I know a little bit about, like, I think it's a council of Nicaea, where like some of the early gatherings where the church started to congeal as an institution. But do you have the sense that it may have been part of the earliest strata?
Yes, very much so. And you're correct. It's the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. Respect, Daniel. That's good. Yeah, which is that's why we call it the Nicene Creed that we pray in Holy Mass, which echoes back from that council. But yes, because when you look at, when Yeshua was living, the Hebrew pronunciation of his name in Palestine in that era, he had an animist way of living. I mean, of course the rivers were alive, and of course the trees were alive, and of course the animals were the sustenance. I mean, it wasn't anthropocentric when he was living it. He wasn't, and there was an inherent and organic connectedness with all that is. That was how the rhythms of his life, even as he prayed the Psalms so often as a Hebrew man, the Psalms speak to this animist reality of the rivers and the trees and the stones and so
like so much of that, there's a risk I'm seeing, and I participated in perhaps of blaming sort of the dominant paradigm and equating that with Christianity, which is fair and not fair. And seeing that, for example, in the United States, if someone says, oh, I'm praying, I'm talking to God, I'm expressing myself, people are going to be like, all right, they're being religious. But if someone's saying, well, God's talking to me, or like I'm getting a message back, or people could be seen as talking to their ancestors, and people might think that's a little strange, but when they start talking back, when you're getting hugged back by the trees. Very normal to me, but it crosses a unspoken line culturally, and moves into a kind of intimacy and relating that I think has been, shamed and judged by a lot of forces, not only by Catholicism. And so I imagine, just from talking with you, my impression is that the teachings both support very explicitly that kind of communion with the different powers, with caution, recognition that not all powers are safe or wise or loving. And also the culture in which the tradition's operating has taken on some of that, I would say superstition, but like caution around the direct contact as well.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think that the longing for communion and to be in connection that is so palpable in today's, in like this current moment, can be so deeply found by the sensing into the earth and the soil beneath our feet, and sensing in between the plant life that is around us, and having moments of warm eyes, and dropping in with the God of one's understanding. And that all of those dimensions, life, mystery, God is communicating back to us, for sure. And even, I mean, the creation story, right? That it was good, and it was good. I mean, all those days, what source, what God created, all was good. I mean, and humans didn't come on the scene. The Sister Elia Delio, who's an incredible, theologian and scientist and Catholic nun in her 60s, and entered Catholic, the convent when she was much older. But she talks about how, if you think about the Big Bang, from that moment, humans would not be, if it wasn't a 24-hour day, humans didn't come on the scene until 11:59 p.m. and the 59th second. Like, people, we have got to like drop into some deep time, like widen our hearts and widen this kind of, and so I say that because for my understanding is that for 23 hours and 59 minutes and 59 seconds, there's been lots of dialoguing and living and cosmic experience that's full and that's amazing, and that we get to be a part of that wider web and that wider tapestry, and none of what I'm sharing is opposed to what is to the Catholic mystical tradition. It's like complementary, it's, and I think I wonder, when you said something before about kind of the blame that Christianity gets, or whatever the dominant paradigm might be, I think we just have a tendency to make things so binary, and really, if we can see more the both and of two different opposing teachings, or to see the both and, where's the common.
Let's circle back to the extending of care to those who have passed but are not yet in the church triumphant, not yet in just a state of wellness and love and connectedness.
Right.
Typically because they're continuing an extension of the suffering or the poor choices they made during life, or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
I want to explore the tension between love and pushiness. Christianity, generally speaking, doesn't have a monopoly on this, but has a bad track record with consent, having been co-opted by Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, and colonialism in the Americas, and both fueling and used to justify, and kind of all mixed up in very harsh, coercive, proselytizing, pushy, empire building things, which are large systemic consent violations. And the tradition is, if Christianity has a strong suit, it's love and devotion. Mm-hmm. One of the strong suits. And so when people hear praying for the troubled dead, it can trigger that making some pushing forcing wellness onto one's suffering in a way that isn't actually welcome, or it's not connective, it's not relational. Like we're going to save poor native people, or some, it can play into that patronizing or dehumanizing quality. So maybe speak a little about how to love passionately others without unintentionally replicating that bad boundary problem.
Amen. I think that one of the brilliances, if you will, of Christ was his and is his deep capacity to meet people where they're at, full stop. And so that's actually what the historical Jesus did when living in those 33 years. That is documented, that no matter who he was around or how he was around them, whether it was like our lepers or Samaritans, the folks on the fringes of society, women that were on the fringes of society, tax collectors, folks who were in bars, that he, there's lots of stories of him being with, sinners. So I would say if someone is longing to be an altus Christus, like Latin for another Christ, which has certainly been a prayer of my heart and being for the last 20 years, every day of my life. It's like, okay, then how might I meet this person right where they're at and love on them and listen deeply? And I think that's a piece of more of the medicine of what Christ was about, that, you know, he was about obedience, Daniel. And like, actually, obedience is a big part of being in right relationship with the God of our understanding, with our ancestors, with one another. That, you know, I think this is somewhere where you and I actually are, you know, are in tandem around the idea of obedience or the idea of sacrifice. And so, you know, I say that because obedience is about listening deeply. It comes from the Latin word obedere, is one etymological root, obedere, which means to listen. And so, like, when I had the vow of obedience for 6 years, to no surprise, that was the one that was the most difficult. I was good to go with the poverty. I lived pretty austere, praise. Was good to go with the sexual honesty. But the obedience was like, wow, this is asking a lot of me, praise. But when I learned, when I could drop in more, that it's really about listening deeply to like what's in the field and who's before me and how they're before me, and listen the whispers of my heart. And that's, I think, what he was about. And I think because Christ could listen deeply and be obedient in that way, he could meet people where they're at in a way that was like graceful and easeful and stern at times. I mean, but the only time he's stern is when is to the Pharisees, who like had dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's and had it all figured out. It's like the only time he's pissed, really. It's like, it's hysterical. So like, if any of those who are listening, you know, if they think that they have it all figured out when it comes to any part of church teaching or any part of doctrine, I would just invite them to sit with the Gospel of John, chapter 2, for example, or, you know, invite them to identify with, yeah, some of who Christ is. So I think that that's some of the ways I'd respond about his capacity to meet people where they're at and to listen deeply. And I'll say the Gospels begin and end with existential questions of like crisis. Like the Blessed Mother Mary cried out when the angel came to her and the Annunciation was happening. She was like, how can this be? Like, that is literally what Mary cried out. How can this be? And then Christ at the end of the gospel, like, cried out from the cross, and beautiful different phrases, but one of which was, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so I think folks, if they can be in those questions instead of in the dogmatism of like knowing that this is the way it needs to go, we need to push things down people's throat, it would be like, when was the last time you asked, how can this be, to the God of your understanding or to your ancestors? Would be, I think, an invitation to the person that is dogmatic in that way. Yeah.
I hear the importance of listening and making space for the other and being receptive and not too righteous.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
And Mary, I mean, when you know the receptivity, there's this beautiful Hebrew word, malchut, M-A-L-C-H-U-T, and her being a Hebrew woman, which could be defined as radical receptivity. And she prayed this prayer, the fiat mihi secundum verbum tuum, that may it be done unto me according to thy word. And I just think if we have that posture, then we don't impose, you know, and inflict harm. So like the example of our indigenous brethren, like, how can we coexist with those two traditions when Catholic folk came to US soil? Instead of decimating those sacred relationships with how indigenous folks were connecting with the divine and connecting with the other than human world, why did they forge ahead in that way, you know? Where was their receptivity or their listening capacity? Yeah.
I'm curious to continue with this thread for a moment of the, what is this? I forget exactly how you said it, but the openness and the confusion, the crying out. Yeah. I know that some of the scandals around sexual abuse and misuse of institutionalized power, but especially around the sexual abuse of behaviors of some priests, has been very dominant in the headlines, and been rocking the church in important and necessary ways. And I'm curious, through the lens of ancestral healing, if you see, like, does the Catholic Church have a ghost problem? Is there a systemic failure to address certain kinds of troubles? Or how do you, like, on a, through the less obvious lens, do you have a read on what's going on, and how, how do you work with that? Not that it's your job, like, as an individual, to work with all of it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one, I think, for just the tenderness for anyone who's listening to this who have been, victims of sexual abuse at the hands of the hierarchy of the church, that, it makes me, I think I just would say, like, as someone who's a practicing Catholic, and broken and blessed in all the ways, I say, I'm sorry for what has happened. I think it's important to apologize, like, on behalf of them, even though I haven't done that, but mercy. So just tenderness and breath to it. And I do think that what has happened, which is, like, there's a ghost problem, that since the Catholic Church hasn't taken ownership for some of the empire and hegemony and dogmatism that has happened for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in all parts of the globe, then if it's not addressed, then it's going to just swell up and swell up. If you and I were to have a conflict and we just didn't address it for like a couple of weeks, and then we're like, well, we just want to address it for like 10 years, and then we just want to address it, and then you come along like 20 years later and you like shoot me an email like, hey, Lindsay, by the way, sorry about that. I'd be like, okay, well, do you want to touch in and like have a conversation and do some repair, Daniel? I mean, I really thought quite highly of you 20 years ago, but it was a real punk move, but we'd want to be, it wouldn't happen overnight. It would need to be repaired. And so similarly, if there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that hasn't, of unaddressed abuse and misuse of power, mercy, I think. And so now here's the church. Certainly, my understanding of it is, like, from a mystical perspective, would be trying, I think God has their attention, the church hierarchy at this point. And are they going to level up, deepen in, take ownership for their part? How is that going to look and feel and sound? And I think they need to start looking at those who've gone before them and like the ghosts that are in the field. I mean, even the article about exorcisms, right? I mean, why is it that exorcisms are on the uprise in the Catholic Church? Interesting that.
We were talking before the interview a little about, it's a kind of segue about the memento mori and the reminder of death. And in some ways, being defrocked or having legal proceedings against you is a kind of memento mori, I imagine. Yes. And I would be interested if you could expand into that, concept or practice. And I know it's a bridge away from some of the gravitas, but it's maybe anchoring it in the more personal sphere of what are the benefits of holding death close, and how can that actually look in Catholic ancestor reverence here?
Yeah, I mean, I think memento mori, right? That Latin phrase meaning remember that I will die, or that one will die. Again, such a big part of the monastic tradition and mystical tradition is for folks to contemplate death, and that it's on the daily. Even some Carmelite orders, they will like have an image or like a skull in their cell in the monastery, like so just to remember that is what will happen. I think that when one learns to die, then they can learn to live. And so having a sort of remembrance that to be like anchored in eternity is clutch. Edith Stein, who's a great mystic of the 20th century, would talk about the importance of being anchored in eternity, that we have like 1 foot here and 1 foot yonder, you know? So yeah, I was going to say something about when we die. Oh, right. Praise Mother Teresa. When, you know, those of us who go to Holy Mass every day, like daily massers, she was kind of speaking to the point of when she would participate in Holy Mass, she would do it as though it was the first time, the last time, and the only time. And I remember learning that when I was like 19 or 20. So when I would approach Holy Mass, that's how I would do it. And then I thought, wow, what if like after I receive communion and I listen to the sacred scripture, like if I live each day that way, like this is my first day, my last day, and my only day. And like how that can shift your understanding of wowee, you know, just it really brings such intentionality and compassion and joy and wonder, and makes things more right-sized, I think. And so with regard to our ancestors, I think saying this is my first day, my last day, my only day, and that knowing that we're connected to those who've gone before us and those who will come, you know, that there's like that deep time, that I'm not here in isolation, right? But when I do breathe my last, God willing, will be inshallah will be welcomed in by not only the cosmic Christ and my ancestors of path, but by my blood ancestors, you know, so yeah, I don't know if that speaks to your question.
Of course it does. Referencing again, just my greater knowledge of Islam, in some verses of Quran, there's verses about the recording angels that are inscribing the different deeds of a person's life on a tablet that one gets to read back to Allah at you could say the day of judgment, or the time of death, or the day when you wake up and you decide to be accountable. Same difference. And this principle of accountability for actions, is it how purgatory and the purification and the suffering becoming church triumphant is characterized, that one after death is asked to be, is that part of how the purification happens?
Oh, indeed.
One has to very specifically check out your choices.
Oh, indeed. I mean, really, like, one could arguably say that the essence of Catholicism is found in Matthew 25 chapter, verses, 31 through 46, which is when Christ, you know, if you welcome the stranger and visit the imprisoned and clothe the naked and feed the hungry and satiate those who are thirsty and visit those who are sick, then you have done unto me. And if you haven't done those things, then you have forgone me. And so it's very clear in Matthew 25 that when anyone breathes their last, we will be accounted with those things. And I think about it not only like me visiting those who are incarcerated, which God knows could be advantageous with the mass industrial, prison industrial complex that's present. Yes, to visiting those who are incarcerated. And also, what about visiting those who are incarcerated in a spiritual or emotional way, right? Or satiating the thirst of those, not only our brothers and sisters who are, right next to Penn Station that are thirsty and homeless, but our brothers and sisters who are thirsty for righteousness and for justice. And so, I think it gets very quick to people who become very concerned with the letter of the law and with dogma and with proselytizing. It would behoove them, and it would behoove the episcopate right now, the Catholic bishops, to sit long and hard with Matthew 25 and with their own. And today's Ash Wednesday. Actually, we're having this encounter on the beginning of the Lenten journey, on the Lenten season. And, how is one doing those 6 mandates, both physically and spiritually, with welcoming the stranger and etc. And John of the Cross, who is one of the greatest theologians ever to live, would say, only loving is my duty. And he's not saying it like tradition doesn't matter and ritual doesn't matter, but it's, we're judged by our choices for sure.
People misunderstand accountability. It's inseparable from love. I think it's some Rumi, but it could be anyone really. Of if you want the garden, move toward the fire. If you move toward the garden, you get the fire. Like if you're only pleasure seeking, it doesn't mean you should renounce pleasure and the goodness of life. But if you want more intimacy, then choose to be accountable to others.
Oh, it gives me the chills. Yes, say more.
I was sitting with a Hawaiian traditionalist in an interview, Kuma Ramsey Tome, the other day, and he was speaking about island consciousness and how if we see Earth as an island, then accountability is enforced in a sense. And it's a very common view in many indigenous cultures or just small scale communities that you can't exile another person. You can't exile aspects of self. You can't exile community members in any long-term way. And even if people behave so poorly that they are executed on purpose as a way to expedite their soul's journey or karmic ripening and to protect the community, they're then cared for ritually after their death. That there's a understanding that nobody's outside the system.
That's
and
right.
so in that way, love looks like accountability to one another.
I mean,
Now, if it gets all legalistic and uptight, like you're saying, then it's problematic. That's not actually soul level accountability.
right.
But yeah, so but they can feel a bit different until you've really sank into what is meant by accountability. Because
Yeah.
it's scary. It's like, are people going to harm me? And many people have been really harmed even before they had words by lack of love. And so
Right.
the idea that somehow this appropriate accountability or taqwa in Arabic, like the holy respect and awe and fear, that in a good way, that can come through other living humans is a
Right.
tall ask when other
Yes.
humans have been so harmful.
Right. Yeah. It's so resonant with, I mean, my understanding of why Christ came on the scene, 2000 years ago was to speak to some of what you're sharing, about love and a love that's robust and that's relational, and that there's a sacred reciprocity, and that he said full stop that amen to loving God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. Do so by loving your neighbor. Like that's how you show your wild, passionate, sacrificial love for God, is by how you're showing up. And then he's so clever about saying it's not just the ones, if you and we have a great rapport. So it's like, oh, you, having admiration for me and me admiring you. It's like, oh, fabulous. Oh, well done, Dr. Daniel Foor Sudeikis. Like, oh, you're both think the world of each other. And like, oh, how impressive that you are like loving on each other, respect each other. It's like, really, it's like, what happens when it's someone who doesn't see eye to eye, or who doesn't think I'm the bee's knees, or isn't a fan? How am I loving on them in my heart of hearts when no one else is watching? It's like, that's what, this kind of wide open-hearted request of Christ is, to say, love your enemies, was like, I'm sorry, like, come again, dude. And it just reminds me of when you're speaking about the gentleman, who you had the conversation with about keeping an eye out, like the preferential option of the poor, like those who are on the fringes of society, are those the ones we're invited to love most deeply. And what I think you and I might see is that it turns out that some of the folks who are the fringes on society are the affluent in the United States of America, believe it or not, because there's such deep spiritual and emotional isolation, and others. But it's
true.
Who are the fringes on the society, So
let's talk for a sec about sex and the ancestors. And Catholicism, I hadn't thought of this before, but has created an interesting situation that I see it a lot in people who are practicing spiritual traditions not of their blood ancestors. So for me, like my German, English, Irish ancestors, I'm not a practicing Methodist or Lutheran and so there's a bit of a, not a split, but a difference between my ancestors of blood and the ancestors of spiritual lineages I might participate in. Now, because there's a habit among some Catholic mystics of having presumably less sex, or at least less children, often, but not always. It seems to create structurally like a difference between ancestors of lineage, like saints, and ancestors of blood. Whereas a lot of traditions don't necessarily create that. Like a lot of indigenous traditions are like, our wake elders are also our grandfathers and grandmas, right? So the discouragement under certain conditions from having sex creates doesn't have to be a split, but a difference. And, in any case, however it gets to be there, what matters, I think, is how do people hold in their heart their love for the saints and the ancestors of tradition without seeing them as better than their ancestors of blood. Because then they're saying they're better than me. And then they're off the hook to not have to live up to those examples.
Right. Yeah. Because as your sense, well, one thing I would say, I think the invitation that, let's say, Thomas Aquinas had to live a life of sexual honesty, which showed up in like celibacy and chastity, because he made that choice, it availed, he had an emotional and psychological and spiritual availability to bear fruit in a way that he may not have had he been partnered and had his own progeny in a physical way. So there is an incredible
daughter crying upstairs.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I mean, the spiritual progeny of these mystics, I think, is very real, you know. And I would say that in my own, from where I'm at in my own state of life right now, that there is an availability that I have, not being married currently and not having children currently, that can avail myself to, like, there is a fecundity and a capacity to hold space in a tender, prayerful, intimate, erotic way for lots of, you know, for the people to like hold it down contemplatively and mystically. So there's that, because I wouldn't want to create like a binary that one is better than the other. Although you're right in saying that the church has said historically that maybe folks who are called to like live like Thomas Aquinas and to be celibate it's a higher state of life than if they're not.
It might just be the church is like training Olympic athletes or something. I mean, it might see itself in a sense that way of like seeing people that are really selected for that calling to go for it, free up the time.
Well, I want to say though, in Vatican II, it corrected this notion that, and didn't make it hierarchical, saying the invitation is to live out what it is that God's calling you to be. That's the ask, and that one is not better than the other. But I would say you do bring up a good point, though. I'm with you around why is it that some Catholic folk, who I'm in lots of conversations and dialogues with these days, I'm curious, why are they putting so much weight in the communion of saints that are canonized, and they're unwilling to go there with their own blood of blood of blood of blood of bone of bone of bone of bone, who are equally communion of saints. I mean, and I think actually if one were to go to their own people, it will only, and I'm speaking now from my lived experience, having gone to my own people, you know, in a very profound way, and in the daily now, in a reverent way, praise, it has only amplified my connection with the canonized communion of saints, you know. So
say more, if you would, about how it has deepened your devotion and faith to include your ancestors of body and blood in your practice.
I mean, I feel like
how's that?
The breath, I mean, the expanse, you know, my sense is that my blood ancestors have such a profound and beautiful investment in me living my life's, I mean, it makes me emotional, and living my life's truth and destiny, you know. And I also, of course, Teresa of Avila does, and Thomas Aquinas. And turns out, because these are my own grandmothers and grandfathers, they, as my parents, have an emotional interest, investment in me doing what's best, you know, living my life's truth. But they all, you know, it's like that, you know, that they have like shown the path forward in such profound and easeful ways, you know, when syncing up with them, because they're so for me. I mean, they're just making it real joyful and easy in some ways, just saying, well, just keep, you know, do this and come here, and being able to identify some of the gifts that I have aren't only gifts of the Holy Spirit. Actually, yes, they're gifts of the Holy Spirit, and turns out they're gifts of, you know, my dad's people have an incredible amount of joie de vivre, joy for living. And since I was a kid, people have commented on that, you know, and I've also with my father have commented on that. And it's like, I have always often attributed it to God is infinite joy, says Teresa of Los Andes, or it's the first fruit of the Holy Spirit. It's like, oh, and also it's literally in my bones for like thousands of years, you know, so, and a medicine I carry. And so it's important to embody that for the healing that it can bring forth in moments of difficulty and great sadness and great trauma, of which it has been used for that, you know? So I think being able to have even a deeper understanding of who I am and how I am, because it's of how my people have been, is so profound. And now I feel like too, what happens is when I like will walk into places, like when I walk in to grab a drink with friends, I've been like, I know it looks like it's just me here, but there's a whole collective, like, can we all fit? Is there room? Can we all, is there room for the cloud of witnesses? Oh, that's all behind us and beneath us, you know? But that's how it feels, that there's just this backing that, yes, that the cosmic Christ is there. And my grandmothers and grandfathers, and by the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And it's like, wow, I am surely not alone.
Beautiful. Yeah, I haven't asked you this, but it occurs to me in my limited knowledge of how the saints are actually related with, in a lot of places, at least, they have different specializations, different particular gifts that people might call on them for. And whether it's the saints or some other aspect of tradition, are there certain deities, forces, aspects of the holy that especially look out for this domain of the human dead, or roles within community? And maybe that's a priest in general. I imagine like priests in general are expected to be at least proficient in stewarding folks to the next reality, things like that. Right. But are there priests who are specialists in assisting those in purgatory, or have, you know, in your perception, whether or not it's named as such, that's a kind of calling or affinity that can be honored and seen and mirrored back and supported by at least Catholic mysticism, if not the church more generally?
Yes, I mean, there are certain religious orders, like the Brigidine sisters, who are dedicated in a specific way, like their charism is praying for the dead. And then certainly within the priesthood and the diaconate, and also certainly lay ministry and Catholic sisters, folks who feel called to like be part of hospice, that, you know, and there's often people who feel even more of a affinity to praying for the souls in purgatory and praying for, so I think those affinities that people have affinities for that particularly. It's similar to how some people have a real affinity for our homeless brothers and sisters, or a deep affinity for our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated, like Sister Helen Prejean, or there are other folks who have that. And as far as powers that support folks who are dying, or the other realm would be like Saint Joseph, big time, is a big patron of those who are dying and those who have died. Also, Saint Michael the Archangel is a big presence to invoke. And I think, you know, I mean, the Exorcist piece is, you know, I just think of that book, The Exorcist Who Tells His Story, it was written by the chief exorcist of Rome. Maybe it came out like in early 2000s. But, you know, priests who have that calling in particular. But I guess that would be getting into more, or there'd be like malevolent energies.
Not necessarily just the troubled dead, but yeah,
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 yeah. So
good. And
yeah.
as we come to completion soon, one question I'm moved to ask is if you hold a vision of 5, 10, 20 years for the medium to near term future for Catholicism, if you imagine that a care and reverence for the ancestors were to be something that was got some traction and folks really took an interest in, what can you see the benefits of that being? Like, what's the vision in that way?
I mean, so such healing, and such repair. I mean, I think that seems to be the bridge between, and again, it makes me tender, kind of emotional to say it, but my sense is you saying it like that, Daniel, it feels like that's the bridge between your work and what your people have called you to, or at least an aspect of it, and my work and what my people have called me to, because I think there's a bridge here of what could bring forth the cultural healing that is so deeply needed, and I think it's really, and if it's just on my heart to share, but let me just say a thing that, I grew up in Holy Cross Parish in Overland Park, Kansas. Not particularly Catholic. I mean, my dad would like drop me off at noon mass and pick me up. It's like hilarious because I wanted to go and they weren't into it. But if I were to just be able to go back to Holy Cross and do like a day long intensive, like 10 to 5, with maybe 15 parishioners, and expose them, introduce them a little bit to this work and this model. And then from there, maybe after the end of the day, let's say a handful of them want to keep going with the work and connect with the different practitioners. And then Holy Cross is like, oh, wow, we cure down the street heard they're like, we love, could you come in and do that same one day thing? And if there could be some momentum and just community, like coalition building and cultivating around this way, my sense is when people, as you've shared so often, when we get well with our own blood ancestors, everyone wins in the macro, So one person doing that impacts 5 people, 15 people, and for folks to do it who are in a tradition that is as beautiful and wonderful as Catholicism is, but as charged and traumatic and as hurtful as Catholicism has been. I think there's a lot of, it's a potent vehicle to do this kind of work because it has there's such a container it already has.
The ancestors, in wanting to prepare us well to join them, even during our life, are going to bring the love in the form of accountability. And if we can stand it, then it only gets better. And positions us to be a more effective and situated participant in cultural healing. And I'm sitting outside the system with the Catholicism, but imagining the church leadership taking the current layers of trouble as an opportunity to really deeply get the lesson around consent and permission and boundaries on so many levels, how awesome would that be? But to accept that level of purification while on earth requires some resilience and some connectedness to other systems that are like, I'm gonna hold you, it's not gonna be comfortable, we're gonna reset some bones. So I mean, that's my riff on it a bit, but it's hard to show up for the cultural healing unless you have a certain amount of resilience. And the ancestors can
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. And I mean, everything, again, when you share there, I like the chills, because it's like you channel it, the way you're just sharing it is, I mean, yes, and I just want to say, I'm just so grateful, Daniel, the way you like carry the gifts and the blessings that and the skill sets that the way you carry it and embody it is so inspiring and edifying and admirable and like easy to be around. It's just I'm so grateful, in a real embodied way of like being in friendship and in connection with you. And it's a gift to be in conversation and friendship with someone who isn't having their ego it really in any way, shape, or form drive them, but is allowing a love which is divine, a truth, which is freeing, to really drive like the narrative and the work. It's like, behold, praise. It's just
it's super uncomfortable to do it other than that, because you get swift feedback.
Because you get what?
Swift feedback. It's not necessarily because I'm that mature. It's just I'm afraid of being crushed by the feedback. Don't do it that way.
Yeah.
Fine. Thank you for the kind words.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad that life has humbled you in whatever ways it has, because the message, the way you embodied it, it's just very efficacious. So praise for the collective, that's what, but you do it one heart at a time. And that's what I think is amazing, that you see the macro, and like, here you are with like Sudeikis, warm eyes to warm eyes virtually, like taking time out of your full, so it's just behold, praise, grateful.
Tell the good people a little bit about what you're offering and how to find it.
This, what we're doing, I feel is what I'm offering.
Get a website and stuff you do.
Oh yeah, but the website, is it's called, Omnia Sancta, is the work that really my people and the God of my understanding have birthed through me, is what it feels like. And it's www.omniasancta, OMNIASANCTA.org, and which is Latin for all is holy. Because it's really my understanding that the breath of the holy and the breath of the divine is in all that is. And so I'm into that and to bringing that more forward. So I offer sessions, one-on-one sessions with folks to step them through the ancestral lineage repair process that you've come up with. And it is so generative and amazing to step people through that work. Also offering spiritual counseling, just allowing folks to become more, inviting folks rather to become more in congruence with who they are and how they are. But the two are complementary. So folks that I'm stepping both, and then I look forward to coming into Catholic parishes. I think that's what feels very alive, to do these one-day intensives, and then from there to allow the ancestors and Christ and the Blessed Mother to do what they do. I've had the privilege of being able to support a lot of these ancestral healing intensives that our folk and our ancestral medicine community are doing. So, and then it's on my heart I've been doing things on like Facebook Live and YouTube Live and on Zoom, because just to widen the message a little bit, it's on my heart to have more of a public presence around some of what we're talking about, not because I need to be doing that at all, but when I drop in, it becomes very clear time and time again that that's what's being asked of me, and I'm happy to be of service in that way, because it seems that it can bring some healing and some love and some grace in really potent ways. So I think that was the offering.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay, for your service.
Yeah. How grateful.
And for your generosity and your love and your kindness.
Thank you.
Yeah. Talk today, and I hope people feel really encouraged to reach out and appreciate what you're offering. And thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Grateful.